Welcome to Robert Bellissimo at the Movies. This is a YouTube video podcast where I explore movies with a guest and from all over the world, and we discuss how those movies were told on film. I want to welcome to the show Samm Deighan, who is a Philadelphia-based writer, editor, and film historian covering everything from classic film to Euro cult. She is the author of a monograph on Fritz Lang's M, and she has contributed liner essays and commentary tracks to over 100 Blu-ray releases. She is also the co-host of Daughters of Darkness, Twitch of the Death Nerve, and Evil Eye podcasts. And her most recent book is The Legacy of World War II in European Art House Cinema, which I just finished yesterday and absolutely loved. Samm, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for doing this.
Thanks so much for having me.
For anyone who hasn't seen the film, I just wanted to discuss the nature of this relationship because, yes, it is sadomasochistic, but I think it's it goes into more complex areas than that. I was curious how you view the nature of their relationship or what you took from it.
I mean, I do think there is a degree of Cavani wanting this to be a sexual fantasy and to be a transgressive film. I mean, when you think about the fact that Last Tango in Paris came out in 1971, and, I think the same year is Pasolini's Decameron. And so the rest of the 70s, Italian producers and directors, I think, felt, if not comfortable, then maybe even pressured by the success of those films and the notoriety of those films to include more sexually transgressive material in their own movies. So I'm not trying to suggest that Cavani made this because she, wanted to sort of profit off of Last Tango in Paris or something, but it gave certain filmmakers who wanted to make more explicit transgressive movies the freedom to do that.
Right.
And so it's so much more than just a story of, two people who encounter each other after the war. It is that, but it also, just the way they kind of absorb into each other and lose their identities, I think really gets into the nature of trauma and traumatic memory and how it can sort of change your sense of self and what your fundamental personality seems to be. And It happens to both of them, which I think is important to note. It's not like he's the dominant one and remains just sort of in control and unaffected. His life unravels as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, no, very well said. No, I agree, because it's, again, as you're right, it's a what if, it's not a what is, so if a German SS officer had fallen in love with someone in a concentration camp, what would that be like? And if it turned into something sadomasochistic, well then I can believe that, because it's born out of pain, it's born out of death and torture, and at the same time, at first you initially see him, tormenting her, those flashbacks. He's like shooting at her in a washroom, and she's trying to get out of the way of the bullets, and he's playing with her, and then suddenly, he's cuddling her and giving her better clothes, and but then then of course the more sexual scenes, he's putting his fingers in her mouth, and so you can understand that it would go in that area because of their environment. And also she was like a teenager, so these are probably her first sexual encounters, so she's learning about sex this way. And then this man, where she's so afraid, is the only one probably giving, even though he's tormenting her, he's also saving her and giving her some kind of affection and love. And so she has these complicated feelings of him, where she's both afraid but yet in love with him, and even perhaps somewhat of a father figure, like you see later on in the film when he says he keeps referring to her as his little girl. So it's as that other woman that he was talking to, who I believe lived in that hotel he worked at in Vienna, and so it's so complicated in that regard. And I actually really, the more you look at it, I don't see that as being anything that's so far out or so like, since oh, let's shock people with this. It's like, okay, well, let's sit down. Like, I think it would have been more offensive if it was just some clear cut romance. Because that would just be like, that would just feel so tacked on.
I mean, I do think that Cavani is intentionally being over the top with their relationship, because they're like, if you want to look at it in the lens of historical possibility, there are a lot of certainly issues with their relationship. I mean,
oh, for sure,
you could spend a lot of time thinking and talking about what that could have looked like in an actual concentration camp, where certainly women were forced to become sex workers, were raped, were forced to exchange sex for food in order to survive, food and blankets and things like that, which, as you mentioned, is a much bigger theme of something like Pontecorvo's Capo.
Yes.
But the big thing to remember is that, much like the modern prison system, concentration camps were set up to intentionally dehumanize people. So movies that have actual, like, straightforward romantic relationships occurring there, it just feels so gross.
And
I
totally.
think this movie acknowledges that this is a fantasy and it's not supposed to represent any kind of ethical relationship. I mean, obviously, for all the reasons that you brought up, looking at their past relationship in the camp, there's no way she could have fairly consented to any of that based on her age. She's a prisoner, and many, many other reasons. But I think the movie doesn't ask you to treat any of this like it's factual. It's just, I think, this allegory for all of these different kinds of complicated feelings we have about trauma and sex and relationships. And I also think where people might have a legitimate point of frustration is that, like, I don't think this is a fair or accurate portrayal of a real sadomasochistic relationship. This is much more destructive and abusive, whereas sadomasochistic relationships are based on a series of agreed upon, well communicated fantasies that are being played out between people who respect and care for each other. And here it's a totally different thing. It's just these people are so consumed by the past that when they see each other again, it's like it unlocks something and their present lives just fade away. Which I think it's interesting that so many filmmakers touch upon themes like that in these sorts of post-World War II movies, because there were a number of Holocaust survivors and war survivors who were artists or kind of celebrated public figures who wound up killing themselves. And so I do think there is this idea that, like, there are some traumas that people just can't move beyond.
Yeah, I think for me that's really the biggest takeaway. I mean, I think you can't really boil this down to a certain essence because it's so complicated. But I think the biggest takeaway is the fact that they both sort of died in those camps already. Like, spiritually speaking, they already died, because, as you said, people, with trauma, you sort of stand still. You can't. I don't want to say everybody can't, but it's very, very difficult to work through something like what these people experience. And so when you see, for anyone who hasn't seen the film, they meet again 12 years after the war in Vienna, and Dirk Bogarde, who plays Max, is working as a night porter in a hotel. And Lucia, played by Charlotte Rampling, is there with her husband, and he's a famous conductor. So they're staying at the hotel, and now this is where they see each other. And the thriller aspect of the film is the fact that Max is facing these trials where
these fake, totally insane show trials. That's one of my favorite elements of the movie.
yeah, because the other former SS officers that he's still in touch with, they're trying to rid the past and burn any documents that they did anything wrong. And so they have these photos, and they ask Mask, hey, do you recognize anyone here? And of course, Lucia, Charlotte Rampling, is in the picture, and now she's there. So of course, the dilemma is he doesn't want her to be killed by them, because naturally they'd kill her if they found her. And so they've chained themselves up in a hotel, and they basically, like in the camps, they imprison themselves again. And he, ties her up, and so they can't take her out. And I love the detail when one of the guys does get in there, and then he says, well, chains can be cut. But, it's almost as if, Max didn't even think about that, because it's sort of more symbolic of the fact that they're reliving everything that has happened to them. And they're because they really couldn't get past it. So I think, for me, that I think it's more about that as opposed to some romance or sadomasochistic romance. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, they're sort of locked together in trauma, I think, is the best way I can describe it. And it would be a very different film if he kidnapped her and held her against her will, but the chains really are symbolic, because if he took them off, she wouldn't leave.
Yes, because as she could just go to the police, but because she's also connected and tied to him deeply, she doesn't want him to be, killed or put in prison. And, because otherwise she would have to, the police would obviously, at least try to get her to testify against him in these trials. So it's brilliant. I mean, it's just, it's so dark, but there's, what I like about the film is that they tell so much of the story visually. If you look at the conversations between Lucia and Max, there's hardly much even dialogue between them. It's really the ways in which they're looking at each other. Of course, it's
so visceral.
It's so visceral, and it's a testament to the brilliant performances by Charlotte Rampling and Dirk Bogarde. When they first see each other again, at first, he thinks that perhaps she's there to testify against him, and he's, smacking her, and he's, why are you here? And then they start to laugh, and then they start to kiss, and then they, at first she's afraid of him. So they must have, I really would love to know how they worked creatively on this, because as an actor myself, to go to those kind of places with another actor, there has to be a lot of trust.
I mean, those are, like, I think they're two of the greatest performers of their time. I mean, still Charlotte Rampling is.
She's so good. She's so underrated in my opinion.
I mean, he definitely talked about in some interviews so he served in the war and was in a unit that liberated one of the concentration camps. I want to say maybe Bergen-Belsen, but
I know it started with a B. Yeah, I think you're right. I read that as well.
And he talks about how that experience was something that changed his life forever. And so I think in his various amazing roles from the 60s and 70s, I mean, everything from The Servant to this film, that he just is a master. He's so good at displaying, like you were saying, without any dialogue, this sense of just like deep, like pushed down emotional pain.
Yeah.
And so when he does play those sorts of roles, like in The Damned, I think he brings so much nuance to it that you don't see in anything like a movie like Schindler's List, which of course is why I wanted to put that still. So the cover of my book is him in the night porter shooting a movie of her in the concentration camp. It's sort of like shown as a flashback to the past, because I think he's in so many of these films.
Yeah, no, he is so good. And as you said, complete. I mean, I think I had only first heard of him maybe 6 years ago, 7 years. No, of course I saw the Night Porter. So I guess that would have been the first time I heard of him, just over 10 years ago. And yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, he can do so much just with his expressions. And this film is old in the behavior, and same with Charlotte Rampling. I mean, I know she has this like, ethereal beauty. I mean, those eyes are like, she looks like a tiger. I mean, but at the same time, she just could convey so much with them. I mean, when they first see each other in the hotel, and that, the audience at first doesn't know that they knew each other already. I mean, obviously by the way they look at each other, they know each other, but you don't know how yet. And just the stunned look on her face. And then, of course, gradually the flashbacks show her in the camps, and he's filming her. And what I love is that you, as the audience, you think, oh, okay, she's seeing an SS officer from the past. And then with each flashback, you see a bit more. And she's also terrified of him at first. She doesn't want to see him. She doesn't even want him to come into the room. But then all of a sudden, what's interesting is that when her husband had to leave, she wants to stay. And naturally, it's because she wanted to go see him. And she even goes, and something I didn't catch before was that she goes and gets a similar nightgown that she wore in the camps so that she could wear it with him. And I love the scene, which is a really fascinating scene, when they're together and she shows him that nightgown, and then she looks in his closet and sees his SS officer uniform. And what I love about what's so interesting there is, like, it's almost like a couple who have been together and they're thinking about their first date, and these people are thinking like about their early romance, but yet it's so twisted. It's like born out of a concentration camp. So on the one hand, I'm feeling sort of like the beauty of just the fact that they love each other, but then I'm sort of like it's so dark at how they met, and unfortunate. I don't know if those moments popped out to you. I'm sure they did, but I was curious.
I think to me, so those moments, and there's a lot about their relationship that feels a little bit satirical to me. Like, Cavani is sort of maybe eviscerating a little bit this fetishization of traumatic memory that, happens in different cycles throughout our culture. And that definitely happened around this period with World War II. So the trial of Adolf Eichmann in the early 60s, it was really the first time that people spoke in a public way about what happened in the Holocaust. And that's when the details were most widely known. But by the early to mid 70s, you have a series of trials throughout Europe based on different concentration camps and different death camps, trying to prosecute people who perpetrated the absolute horrors that took place there. But when you read about the history of those trials, it's like basically just this media frenzy where there are these survivors giving this like unimaginably horrifying testimony. But it almost feels like a show trial, sort of like in The Night Porter, where it's like, okay, we're going to bring this into media attention, and then we're not really actually going to do anything. Because in most of those cases, the people who are put on trial are like, most of the camp commandants by that point were dead or, had disappeared. which I think she also sort of connects back to the like Nazi sleeper cell that's waiting around and trying to find something to do. But there, I think for a lot of people in the 70s, like Cavani, definitely like Pasolini, there's this sense of like, why are we still living in this trauma, but we're not actually confronting it, and it just feels hypocritical. And West Germany was particularly guilty of that, where it's like, we're going to have these trials to make people feel better, but no one's actually going to be punished, and we're not actually going to address the fact that we just absorbed the majority of these people back into our society, right, and they were never really punished.
Right. Yeah.
And so I think there's a lot about that going on in a deeper way in the way that their relationship plays out, and how they just like repeat these things and put on these old costumes.
Yes. And then of course you see at the end, you know, when he basically gives up and puts his uniform on, and she puts on that same dress, like exactly, you know, not only that, like he even dresses her up like she looked like she was 15 again. And they go out and they're shot down, which of course was symbolic of the fact that I think that really they were already, because they couldn't confront what happened, and I don't blame them that they couldn't. They were already dead in a lot of ways. So it's really powerful emotion. It's one of those films that every time I see it, when it ends, I'm sort of like, you get so invested emotionally in it that you forget where you are, and then you just have to like breathe for like 5 minutes. Like it doesn't. I've seen it maybe, I don't know, 5 times. I mean, not like a ton of times, but I've, you know, a decent amount. And I always have a very similar reaction, very visceral reaction.
Me too. And I've seen it a lot of times. I think there are similar narratives to this in other films that are like actual, like low budget Nazi exploitation films that don't have that just feel really offensive and don't have any of the emotional impact. And I think it's just the strength of the directing and these two performers that make it feel so much more than that. Because to the question that you raised, or sort of connected to the question that you raised earlier, like, how do I respond when people are offended by this movie? There are definitely a number of film critics who, over the years, I think have questioned whether this should be thought of as an art house movie or an exploitation movie. And I think that's part of its genius, is it's not telling you how you can classify it. It's forcing you to think about it.
Yes, yeah, that's exactly it. It's not giving you all the answers. I mean, you have to really, which are the kind of films I like, that they're so detailed and so complicated, particularly psychologically, that you both, it's not that you're just thinking your way through it, but you're both really feeling it, even if it's making you mad or
yes, or uncomfortable.
Then, yeah, exactly, or uncomfortable. But then you really have to give a lot of thought to the whys behind all we see. And as we said, so much of this film is told visually. Like, it's not like someone's coming and saying, let me explain this to you. You know, it's you have to really fill in the blanks. And I love the cinematography of this is so beautiful, in, you know, the Vienna and the flashbacks. This was by Alfio Pontoni. He also did Il Sorpasso and The Priest's Wife, 2 films I love, plus many others. Would you say this was sort of like expressionistic, and it was very gray and black and blue? There's hardly any colors in it.
Yeah, which I think is meant to intentionally evoke some of those 30s and 40s films. I guess some of my favorite art house films of the 70s from Italy, I think I associate with being very colorful, and this is very intentionally a muted color palette.
Yes, yeah. When you say 30s and 40s, you mean like European 30s and 40s?
Oh, yeah. Like the sort of expressionistic stuff that I think it's trying to reference, or intentionally is referencing, because they are basically trapped in that past.
Yeah, exactly. And that the music in this film by Daniele Paris. I love that song. I mean, you could just listen to that all day. That song off the top that you hear throughout the film I don't know if was that written for the film? I don't know if you happen to know that.
I think it was. I know that Carl Böhm, who is Karl-Heinz Böhm's father from Peeping Tom, also did some composing for this.
Oh,
but I think that music already existed and was just used.
Yeah, because just looking on IMDb, there's a bunch of different songs written in it, but this one, the title of the song is the same as the film, so I imagine it was for.
I'm pretty sure some of it is original, and then there's of course a lot of 40s music that's used in it.
Yeah, no, definitely. One thing I noticed this time when I saw it again was, when you see Matt, like it, because it's told with the utmost empathy, but really Max, through even in Vienna, is not a nice guy. I mean, with his coworkers, he's very bossy, and he's almost abusive towards them. That other one guy he works with, he's like telling him to get out and did you do this? And he's one guy's like, off the top you see is like a prostitute in the hotel that he's basically pimping this guy out. Because every time I think of this, I think about the fact that he, you see him when he's alone, he turns off all the lights, and then he even says to the other SS officers, I don't like to be in the light. So naturally it's because he just cannot, he can't face himself. So he'd rather just shut everything off. And I think that's another reason it was symbolic of the fact that he was working at night. So you see that a few times, how he was constantly shutting the lights off. And when his coworker turned them on, he just, he flipped out. But I never, of course, and with Lucia, every time he needs something from her, like information, for example, his first instinct is to smack, to hit. So again, I think he almost hates himself, but it's because he can't confront himself. And you're not really too sure, like obviously the other SS officers are still, hold on to that Nazi, ideology. Whereas with him, you're not so sure because, at one point he does the Nazi salute towards them when they were like, I don't regret anything I've ever done, when they're talking on top of the roof. And then he does the Nazi salute first and then they do it. And then he just kind of shrugs, like, it was almost as if to say, guys, I was kidding.
He seems,
I don't know what you
very, very tired by life. Like,
right.
In contrast, I think the former Nazis, they remind me of those sorts of guys who kind of sit around and talk about their glory days in college.
Days,
but like instead of their glory days being in a frat house, they're working as Nazi guards in a concentration camp. And you do get the sense that their show trials and their constant discussions about, some action that could be happening in the future is all just fantasy until Lucia arrives and there is this tangible, real reminder of the past. Because at the time in the 70s, you also have to remember that there were people like the Wiesenthals who were going around actively hunting Nazis. And, Mossad in Israel was working with them. That was sort of one of their big projects at the time. So I do think there is this real life element that they maybe were afraid of being captured and arrested and brought to trial. But it's also almost like they get off on that fear or that anxiety because there's nothing else in their lives. And I think Max is the only one who is aware that there's nothing else. Like he just seems so empty.
Yeah, that's interesting because it actually never occurred to me that those trials they were worried about are not actually happening, because I actually thought that they were happening. So you thought that that wasn't a real threat? Like that was not something that was actually going to happen?
I think it's something that they are blowing way out of proportion. It's like, because this whole identity and this time in history, it's like that was the time that they felt really the only time probably that they felt powerful and important.
I see.
So I think they fixated on it so much that it definitely gets blown out of proportion. At least that's my reading of it. Like, yes, certainly former Nazis who were higher profile guards were in danger of being arrested and taken to trial, but it didn't really happen to that many people, which is why, to me, it seems like I was saying earlier, like it was a symbolic gesture, but also that's why I don't think they really had anything to worry about, because, like, yes, there were Nazi hunters around, and yes, there were these trials, but to me, it just seemed like a bunch of self-important windbags wanting to feel important still.
That's interesting because actually, now that I think back, I remember when they asked Max, "Hey, you worried about this?" He's like, "No." I forgot about that, and I was wondering. I'm like, why is he not as worried as these guys? But now that you make sense, it's because it wasn't like, "Hey, you got to be in court Thursday" and all this kind of stuff. They were just preparing for something that may or may not happen. So. Yeah, that's interesting. And really, these guys have no guilt about anything. Like, they seem to just be fine. And as you said, they've integrated into society, whereas Max is much more tormented by, and again, Max is a guy who executed people. I mean, you hear that, and you see in his behavior that he's cruel, even not just with, as I said, not just with Charlotte Rampling as Lucia, but with the other people. Which, when I read your book, it's I as you explore all the different countries or were complicit or compromised out of necessity, when you see more of a sympathetic Nazi, I was curious, in your research, did you find some, like, were there Nazis was there a number of them who came out to regret their actions?
Well, I think this is a complicated question, because what winds up happening is this, and you can see this throughout a lot of West German, specifically some East German as well, but definitely West German art and cinema and literature and even media in the 50s and 60s, is this idea that there's this just like deep sense of shame that no one should talk about.
Right.
And so there wasn't really a platform for people to come forward and say, I really regret my actions. Like, that's something that maybe happened 50 years later. I mean, you see similar things going on in Japan with this like constant refusal by the Japanese government to accept any responsibility for the atrocities in China. But it's like every once in a while you get individual people who were there who just before they die say, like, yes, I was there, I did this, I'm sorry. If you read, there's actually this really interesting accessible book called In the Garden of Beasts, which is written by the guy who did The Devil in the White City, that sort of nonfiction book that looks at serial killer H.H. Holmes, who was operating in Chicago during the World's Fair, and it kind of juxtaposes those two things. In the Garden of Beasts is about the American ambassador to Nazi Germany who lived in Berlin with his family during part of the war. And in that book, he talks a lot about sympathetic Nazis and people who changed their mind. I mean, there are people who tried to, like, Nazi officers who tried to assassinate Hitler for a variety of reasons.
Right.
But I think when you are put into this situation where there's nothing else for you to do other than, join the war effort or go into a concentration camp, it changes the way people think about things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so I think there's a lot of mass pressure after the war not to, like, there just really was no cultural environment for people to express regret.
Right. Right.
And
Yeah.
you have people like in high level political positions who were former Nazis who do everything they can in the 50s and 60s, like under Adenauer in West Germany, to repress any mention of the fact that they served in the war. So I think it's just this, like, put your blinders on and forget that any of this ever happened. Like, that's
Right.
what's encouraged.
Right. Yeah, it really makes me wonder when I read your book and of course see something like The Silence of the Sea, which, the Nazi officer there is this guy who like loves France, loves like
he loves art and culture, and
yeah.
Howard Vernon is the greatest.
So great. So great.
And what's fascinating to me is that so many Central European actors, and Howard Vernon is Swiss, so many Central European actors who left Europe because of the war or, whatever they were doing throughout the 40s and 50s, so many of them were forced to play Nazis and they hated it. Like Conrad Veidt, the great German actor, has an amazing role as Major Strasser in Casablanca, but talked in interviews about how much he fucking hated playing Nazis.
Right.
And how it made him not want to act because with his accent, it seemed like those were the only roles he could get. So I love that Howard Vernon, who has had such an incredible career working with like everyone under the sun, was willing so soon after the war, really, to play a sympathetic Nazi. Like, it just is bold because he's so likable.
He is. He totally is. And it just, again, this was made by Melville, who was part of the French resistance, right? So it's like,
and was Jewish.
And was Jewish, which is really fascinating to me. And, another thing that I'm not sure if I saw it before, but one line that I don't recall hearing in The Night Porter was when he's meeting with Mario, the guy who they think will possibly be able to recognize Lucia in the photo. And so Dirk Bogarde plans to kill him on a fishing trip. He mentions that she was a socialist daughter. So I forgot that actually her character is not Jewish. And I know that Cavani said she did that intentionally so people perhaps wouldn't be as outraged, or this wouldn't be this long conversation about the torturer and the person in a concentration camp who's Jewish, because of course, as we all know, Jewish people were targeted the most and got the worst treatment. But as Cavani said, there were all kinds of camps. And as you said in the book as well, I mean, there were socialists in there were resistance fighters, there was all kinds of people. And so she was just happened to be the daughter of a socialist. So I imagine she did that for maybe a little less outrage. I don't know what you think.
I think so. I feel like, though, that's one of the most complicated elements of the film, because the overall issue with a lot of World War II movies, especially movies made during the war years, but this also, I think, applies to movies made afterwards, is the degree of anti-Semitism that I think might not be intentional, but is just sort of inherent and kind of like latent. And what I mean by that is there's this erasure of Jewish experience. When you think about a film like Schindler's List, there are really no major Jewish characters. They're all these like two-dimensional stereotypes who kind of exist on the fringes of the film. And the biggest characters are non-Jewish Germans like Oskar Schindler and some of the Nazis. And you see it so often in movies where they talk about how the Nazis are evil, and everybody can agree on that point, but
Right,
they're
of
much
course.
hazier about who the victims of the Holocaust are. And some movies will actually come out and say, especially a little bit later, like Capo, it leaves no ambiguity. It's like, she is a Jewish girl.
Right.
But it's like filmmakers in general are reluctant to say how big of a target the Jews were, which is something that I like. I get what Cavani is trying to do and not have it be as transgressive as if it's, a Nazi officer and a Jewish woman, but it's still like, why in general do filmmakers seem so hesitant to just say, like, yes, the Jews were the primary victims of the Holocaust? Like,
Right.
there's also a chance that it could be a reflection of Nazi policy. So, like, an attempt to sort of be historically accurate. And by that, what I mean is, generally in concentration camps, officers sort of did whatever they wanted, meaning they were allowed to have sexual relationships with prisoners, whether that meant rape or something that might be described as I don't think you can have a real consensual relationship in that particular environment, but it pretty much said, as long as you don't have any relations with Jewish women, which, of course, one of the really big taboo subjects, even for historians and even for Holocaust memoirs, is sexual violence in the Holocaust. Like, I think there's this big reluctance on the part of survivors to talk about it, which is understandable. And so it hasn't really been featured in the history of the Holocaust as much as it should, because certainly Jewish women were raped. But I think the more standardized versions of history talk about how, like the joy divisions, the Nazi brothels, the women who were forced to be sex workers there were not Jewish women. And so I think it's the official policy was like, well, it's okay if you want to, rape someone, but try and make sure it's not a Jew. And so it's just like
I
all
didn't. So
kinds of.
that was an actual I didn't know that. So that was a policy.
It was,
Yeah.
I don't know if it was like officially written down, but yes, it was a clearly understood policy that, we're not trying to mix the races or whatever
Oh, I
horrible
see. I
way
see.
they
I
thought of
see.
describing it.
I
But
see.
it still happened.
Of course, the famous scene, one of the most famous scenes, is that cabaret style scene where, of course, she's in the SS officer hat and she's got the suspenders on. And what this Marlene Dietrich style song that she's singing. And what's interesting there is, again, it plays like I don't think Cavani meant it to be like sexy or anything, but it kind of is. Like,
I think she meant it to be sexy. Cavani knew exactly what she was doing.
Oh, just based on what she said on the Criterion channel, she's like, "Oh, it became a sexy thing." But she was like, "Oh, well,
feel like,
yeah, I don't know. I don't know. Maybe she was trying to. I don't know what her intention was, but
yeah, not to contradict her, but I feel like the way that scene is shot, she knew exactly what she was doing, but then maybe tried to soften it afterwards.
Perhaps
when people were just like enraged.
perhaps. Do you
say
think
that it was unintentional?
Yeah, perhaps. Do you think that was to illustrate that she was being forced to kind of compromise and now like dance for them? I wonder, or was it mainly just like, oh, let's put something in here that something sexy? I don't know what you thought.
Yeah, I assume it's just a callback to the sort of Weimar decadence that is such a staple in those early movies, like The Blue Angel and things like that. And I think it's another scene that really signifies how this movie is intentionally flirting with that boundary between art house and exploitation.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. What's
like
so
she wants to be erotic and she wants to be transgressive.
Right.
She being Cavani.
Right. And what's interesting is that the scene suddenly just flips on a switch when that head is delivered. And she's, and Dirk Bogarde smiling over this, head in a box, and Lucia's looks like she's going to throw up as a result of it. And that was another thing about Max, that even in later years, when he's talking to the woman who lives at the hotel, and he's saying, "Oh, our story is a biblical story," and then he tells that story like it's just like out of Salome, like this. She told me that this person was tormenting her in the prisons, and she said, "Hey, can you transfer him?" And I thought, what would be a better idea? I'm going to cut his head off.
I'm just going to chop his head right up. Yeah.
And he's laughing about it. So it's again, it's sort of like this guy is, I know it's interesting that the SS officers say that he's unwell. I mean, obviously they're the ones who are truly unwell, but
everyone in this film
he is too. And it's just another illustration of like the psychology of this man, that he's still amused by the fact that he cut someone's head off 12 years later.
I also think it's a comment on how life in those extreme environments can dramatically change people.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, it's that's always a moment that it's just unforgettable.
Yes,
both visually and just what it reveals about Max in particular. And I think that's why you often saw her even later scared of him, or when he's hitting her, and she sort of is helpless towards it, because I think she is sort of afraid, because she knows what he's capable of. She knows what he's done, which just makes for another layer to how complicated this relationship is. Well, Samm, thanks so much for coming on. I really appreciate that you took the time to talk to me today about your book and The Night Porter. So thanks so much. And I hope you can come again sometime and talk about some more either World War II films or anything, because I know you're a big film buff. So please come again.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me and for the kind words about the book.
Thank you so much, everyone, for watching. I hope that you've enjoyed this video. I want to thank all of my members on Patreon. If you're interested in becoming a member of my Patreon, head over to the link patreon.com/Robert Bellissimo at the movies for full details. And lastly, if this is your first time here, please consider subscribing to my channel by pressing the Robert Bellissimo at the movies logo. You will see it floating above my head in the top left corner to your top left in just a second. Just click on that, and then click the bell in order to get a notification every time I release one of my new videos or when I go live. Thank you so much, everyone. I will see you in the next episode.